The middle class has just been wiped out in this country, and nobody's talking about it. It's really, and I think that's why, Trump was so popular. Is he, was talking? He was the one guy who's talking to those people, and and he's saying, and they're angry because nobody's listening to him. And Trump said, I'm listening to you, and I'm going to go break things for you. And they are angry, and they want things to get broken. And I think, my father used to look at Latin America, and it was the same thing back then. It was widespread poverty below, and it was wealth above. And U.S. foreign policy was to sort of fortify those oligarchies and support with weapons, et cetera, the military juntas that were keeping those people in suppression because they were anti-communist. And my father said, there's going to be a revolution in those countries. And if we continue those policies, the communists are going to own the revolution, and they're going to own the future. And we have to give aid directly to the poor and stop giving it to the oligarchs and stop giving it to the military. And that's why my uncle and father started the Alliance for Progress and USAID, to do something that had never done before, which is to develop middle class by funding the development of middle class of the poor. And I would say the same thing is happening in this country today, that where the oligarchs are running things and the military, and there's going to be a revolution, and either it can be owned by Donald Trump, or we can try to, marshal and mobilize that energy for a more idealistic vision of our country. And, when my father ran in '68, he put together a populist coalition of left and right. And, and he was able to do that. He was able to do that by telling the truth to people, including truths that they didn't want to hear. And he was, on the last day that he died, the day he died, he won the most urban state in our country, which was California, and the most rural state, which was South Dakota. He had bridged the gap between, and when I was with him when he died in Los Angeles, and then we flew his body back on US-2 on Humphrey's plane, Vice President Humphrey's plane to New York, and then we waked him in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and the crowds just it was like a flood of humanity on that street. The whole street was blocked. People standing 10 feet deep for half a mile. And then we brought him from Penn Station in Washington. He was in the caboose and the coffin, and then there was a train that we took to Union Station in Washington, D.C. And the people on that train were the people who would have been probably one of the greatest governments in United States history. And that train ride was supposed to take 2.5 hours. It took 7.5 hours. Because there were 2 million people on the tracks, and they were white people, they were people in military uniforms, they were Boy Scouts standing, saluting. I remember passing a little league field where all of the people, all the kids on both sides were standing, holding their gloves and saluting, and the coaches and all the people in the stand. There were Catholic priests, there was rabbis. I remember passing in Delaware. I was 14 at that time. A pickup truck that had 6 or 7 nuns in their habits, standing in the bed of the truck, and they were waving rosaries and handkerchiefs at us. In the major urban centers, the train stations, we crept through at a crawl to avoid hitting people, but they were just jammed with people, almost all black people in Trenton and Newark and Baltimore and Wilmington. And they were singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. We had the windows open on the train, and then there were hippies and tie-dyed T-shirts. You can go look at the people. There's photographs of the people lining that track. You can call them up over there, James, if you find them. But anyway, when we got to Washington, President Johnson met us there and took us in a convoy. We rode past the mall, and when we got to the mall, my uncle, or my father, and Martin Luther King had been talking together, and they were talking about how do we get poor people the right, because the Vietnam War was sucking all the money out of the war and poverty, and they said, how do we get poor people to get politically mobilized? And they said, we need to call them all to Washington, D.C. and have them camp here until Congress acts. And so the king had died 2 months before. My father was now dead. Marion Wright Edelman had brought all these people there, working for the two of them. And there were thousands of men that were encamped in these plastic shanties on the mall. And they all came to the sidewalk and they bowed their heads and held their hats to their chests. And we drove slowly past them up to Arlington Cemetery, and we buried my dad next to my uncle. 4 years later, so that was 1968, 4 years later in 1972, I was studying politics in Boston and American history, and I came across this demographic data that showed that the white people who had lined that train track and who had supported my father in Maryland and Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey during the 68 campaign in the primaries in 72 did not vote for George McGovern, who was very simpatico with my father on all these issues, very much aligned. They voted instead for George Wallace, who was absolutely antithetical to everything my father believed. He was a rampant, fierce segregationist, and I knew him very well in his old age. But it occurred to me then, and it struck me many times since, that every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side. And the easiest thing for a politician to do is to appeal to our hatred and our bigotry and our fear, and our xenophobia and, our mistrust of immigrants or whatever. And that every once in a while, politicians like my dad come along who have a different approach, which is to persuade people one way or another to transcend their narrow self-interest and see themselves as part of a community, as part of a larger adventure, and be willing to take risks for neighbors who don't look like them because they feel like they're part of something important, part of maybe reconstructing our country and making it live up to its promises. And to avoid the seduction of the notion that we can advance ourselves as a people by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind. And my dad was able to do that successfully. And I think, that we have that opportunity now. And